Okay, great. So I think everything is set up now. So
Yes.
thank you. So I'm going to introduce the introduction first. So we are honored here today to have the presence of electrical engineering and computer science professor Mansur Dale. He's the director of the MIT's Institute for Data Systems and Society, IDSS. IDSS has been supporting several of our cohorts of students that are completing the professional master's degree in data science here in UTEC. And today he's going to be presenting the latest updates on his talk, Data-Driven Response to a Pandemic and Isolate. So nice to have you here again, Mansur. So welcome. And if you want to share the screen or start, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Good, I guess afternoon, good evening, or good afternoon is the right timing. Everyone, it's a pleasure for me to be back here and talking to all of you. We're very proud of the program that we have at UTEC, and we are also very excited about the students engaging our educational program and the MicroMasters, and looking forward to more people participating in the future. I think the main idea for my presentation was to also give an example of why the work that we do in IDSS and the work that we do at the MicroMasters, and why that is actually really critical in the education for the next cohort of students in data science. So I'm going to share my screen, and this is based on a talk that I've given here before. Sorry, it's this one or that one? I'm just so confused. Okay, there it is. Is this the right one with the right format, or should I flip it?
Yeah, that's okay.
It's okay. All right, good. So let me adjust the audience. Yeah. So as I said, that this is a talk that I gave before, but it's a few updates on it and so forth. The main aspect of the talk is so much to talk about what I said before, and that is the role of data science in solving societal problems. The example I want to give is COVID-19 pandemic. To just talk a little bit about intervention, testing, and economic impact. And as I said, primarily to show how these problems present themselves to us and how data science starts helping us answer some of the questions that emerge. So back in April 2020, actually March 2020, we had, the world went into a lockdown. And you know, there was this virus, although we knew something about SARS-CoV, we really didn't know about this COVID-19. It seemed to be a slightly different virus than the regular viruses that we have dealt with before. And so we, at MIT and like many other places, we felt like we have to contribute to this big societal challenge. All of us started feeling, you know, why am I working on this problem? I should be working on COVID, because that seems to be the imminent problem. Everyone is so concerned about it. So at IDSS, we created this COVID-19 collaboration. We called it Isolate. And this collaboration, every day in the weekday, we met at 5 p.m. We opened up this meeting to everybody in the world. You know, we were advertising for, and we had people from, certainly from South America, we had people from Europe, people from Asia joining us. And part of the meeting was, well, is there something we can do that we can be helpful as data scientists or system scientists, for example? Maybe epidemiologists can join us. Part of the meeting was about us meeting each other because we couldn't meet in person. So at least we have a time in the day where we all can get together and exchange ideas and so forth. So there was a social aspect to this that was actually different than what I'm talking about, but was very important. You know, I had during that time some research scientists, postdocs that just joined my group. Maybe I saw them once in person, and I spent the next year not seeing them except on Zoom. and but at least I saw them often every day. And so there was a social aspect of this. The whole thing was very disruptive. And I would say until today, we're still disrupted by COVID-19. The reports this morning from a lot of the vaccine companies is that the existing vaccine right now does not deal with the newest version of Omicron. And then people are saying, but wait a minute, Omicron is not even, it's not even a thing. Like, people get it and they don't even notice that they had it. So the debate is there. The fear of closing down is still back in our minds and so forth. In any case, a lot of people participated in this effort, and those are the people that ended up writing articles and creating a data lake. So what we did, we clearly recognized at the beginning that we didn't have enough data. No one knows anything about this disease. So any data set that we could access, we wanted to grab. NIH published some data. Hopkins, Johns Hopkins had a database that was accruing information about how many people are infected, how many people have died, and so forth. We were collecting data from senior citizen homes. Then we were collecting data on lockdowns and mobility and how mobility has impacted all of this. And this data was building, but at the beginning, as the data is building, people are asking for answers. They wanted to know, what should we do, And one of the things that we wanted to always explain to people is that there's always something that can be done. Small amount of data to more data, there's always something that can be done. What is important is to know how confident you are about what you're doing. How do you assess the level of accuracy to anything that you're predicting or a decision that you're making becomes really important. And, it kind of like raises the question of how do we deal with pandemics in general? Are we ready to deal with pandemics? The Spanish flu occurred back, almost 80 years before, 90 years before, right? And, people wore masks for the Spanish pandemic, for the Spanish flu. So the masks were the first thing that we were wearing. I mean, that was the first solution. Actually, we didn't have anything more sophisticated at the beginning than what was happening 90 years before. Wear a mask and keep a distance. Well, I mean, that seems like a fairly powerful and interesting solution. Have we come far now? Well, I think, yes. I think the demonstration of the vaccine, being able to get the vaccine within 9 months, I think that was an incredible feat, And more interesting is the story of what kind of vaccine, getting the mRNA vaccine. That was more of a fantastic story, given the fact that mRNA was not effective in any drug release before then. So a lot to be reported on from the biological perspective and the genetic perspective, which is not the purpose of this talk. At the point of before the vaccine time, we were looking at things like this. We were looking about, 148 million positive cases. This has changed. Like, for example, right now we are reported about double the amount of deaths. About 6 million people died. But at that time, we were looking at 3 million people dying. We didn't have a vaccine. We had a virus that had a very large incubation period, about 14 days. Around April, May time, we just started the PCR test, but we didn't have a lot of them. They were scarce. They had to be allocated. They were expensive, $70 per test at that time. Very expensive. We had antibody tests and we had, viral tests and so forth. Everybody was saying vaccines on the way, but vaccines were not there yet. And yet we wanted to make some decisions. So how did that process? What's the history and how that evolved? And why is this an interesting story? Okay. Well, it was interesting because what did we have data about? We had data about people, infections. We had data about the virus itself. Some of the biologists were coming in and saying, look, I mean, this is a very small virus. Its protein is actually quite powerful, the tentacles that attach to the cells and so forth. They never called it airborne, but in principle, it was kind of airborne, right? It was airborne in the sense that a small volume that you can propagate in the air could actually arrive and infect you, and because of its ability to latch, it was able to grow even from small volume. So we're getting information about the virus itself, and we were trying to impact policy. We were trying to say what institutions need to do. So do we lock down? Do we close the schools? Do we send the students home? So many decisions. And none of these decisions are independent of each other, and they all had incredible economic impact. So the data that we were observing, we were looking at infection, we're looking at hospitalization, we're looking at what every effect of any policy that we adopt. So we're looking at economic impact, right? What could we do? Well, we could lock down until the vaccine is there. We could test and quarantine, and the early decision, that was the thing that we had. We test, and if you are positive, we quarantine you. And so then we are taking people out of the system who are infected. We try to see if that actually was helpful or good enough. And we were measuring the economic, we were having some economic decisions, and that was very important because, well, not all the jobs had to close. Can't close all the jobs. So what that means is that we have to close some jobs. There's an economic decision that is made, which had an economic indicator. This is the interplay. This is the data that we were collecting at that time. And you can see, data was accruing over time, but decisions needed to happen in real time. And what I also want to say is that to all the anti-scientists out there, that science is not a fact. Science is something that evolves, and we discover and we learn. And so the fact that scientists one day would say, here's what you should be doing, and then 2 months later they say, well, actually, no, you should be doing something else, is not in contradiction with science. Because science is about discovery. We make decisions, the best decisions that we can make at the time when we have that information. We continue to update and collect data to improve our information. And I think that this is a very important message for all the deniers out there who keep criticizing, oh, you told us this and now you told us that. Absolutely. That's going to be happening. You're going to be hearing different things until we have all the facts built up. And it's a complicated story. We don't have all the facts. So what was happening is that initially the data was so noisy that epidemiologists were throwing their hands and saying there's nothing we can do, because we cannot build the models and we cannot train the models that can predict for us what we need to do. But data scientists were saying, wait a minute, you cannot just wait until the whole thing is built and you have all the data. You need to work with the kind of data you have. So what was the data that we had, and what sort of decisions were being made? So let me give you an example. It's just an example. There's a ton of other examples out there, but a statistical example that we wanted to understand, right? So here's a typical, by the way, you see my cursor when I move it? Do you see a cursor that I move?
Are you moving it now?
Yeah.
I don't think we, yeah, there it is.
Okay, so it's
yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you. So, so here's a typical curve that we have of what we think an infection, a stable infection looks like. At some point, people start getting infected, and they peak at a certain value, and maybe that infection drops and goes away. That's what we call a stable infection, right? We don't know whether COVID was a stable infection, but this is what the population does. The population breaks down into multiple groups, okay? The purple group over here have severe symptoms. They may be ill. In the case of COVID, I mean, those are people that couldn't breathe because the system, the respiratory system was the one that was hit the most, right? So these are the severe cases. Now, a whole bunch of people here in orange that are mild, they're having a cold symptom, but it's nothing that they're concerned about. There was a whole bunch of people that were asymptomatic. And part of the fear that we had from this disease, of course, is that there are so many asymptomatic people. It looked like younger people with the early stages of COVID, a lot of them were asymptomatic. What that meant is that these are people walking around infecting others without knowing anything about the fact that they are infecting other people. Because, there's a stabilizing effect of every disease when everyone is symptomatic. When you are ill, you stay home. When you stay home, you don't transmit the disease for other people. This is a situation where you're asymptomatic and transmitting the disease. Okay, so what was happening early on is that, well, the people who are asymptomatic didn't know they have it. There were no testing strategy. There's no testing, so they didn't know they have it. People with mild symptoms potentially ignored it. And people with severe symptoms showed up to the hospitals. Okay, and they're calling doctors and showed up to the hospital. So the data that was recorded for us was essentially the severe cases. And so now we are here with this mind frame of this virus causes severe problems, right? Because we're only collecting data on people that are severe. They're self-reporting because they are in a tough situation. So we had to sort of try to understand, and then you know, from a statistical point of view, right? You know, you would say, so one aspect is be cognizant of the fact that the data you're measuring is biased. Because it's self-reporting from severe cases, you may draw conclusions that only the cases are the severe cases, right? Because that's what you report. But that, of course, was not the case. And very quickly, we understood that there are many other mild cases. The other thing I wanted to show you is that, you know, one way to model this data is to think of, and I'm not going to get too technical in this talk, but, you know, you look at the ratio between the number of infected people tomorrow divided by the number of infected people today. How does that ratio grow? Okay, you know, and so if you take the logarithm, we would like it to be in some linear function a minus bt. This is equivalent to saying that the number of people is an exponential function in time. Okay, so it grows, a times t is an increasing function of time. So the number of people is large, unless this b factor here is large enough that compensates and drops it. Okay, so a picture like this, where a minus in the logarithm, a minus bt looks like this, that's a nice stable infection. It goes up and then comes down. As time increases, t squared becomes larger and this term becomes negative and it goes down. In a bad situation where it's not a stable infection, this quantity is flat. B is equal to 0. When B is equal to 0, it only grows. Of course, there's a limit to the population, but it's locally growing and it's not stabilizing, right? And so the other thing that we needed to do is to understand, are we in this regime or this regime? But we're only collecting the data on the purple. That was what was happening in April. Okay, that was April 2020. That's the data that we had. So we had to make a whole bunch of assumptions, right? Because, I mean, how could you proceed? But we can't say, oh, this is just a small amount of data, we will ignore it. We'll say, let's just see what we can do with this data, okay? How can we systematically learn from this thing, right? So how can we utilize this information? Well, one assumption we made at MIT is to say, look, you know, the severe cases is a fixed fraction of the total number of cases. That is, you know, if the severe cases appear in people with certain pre-existing conditions or older generation, those are a fixed fraction of the people. And so then the severe cases will be a fixed fraction of the people. I don't know that fraction, but I know that if I estimate everything on the severe cases, the real cases will be just a scaling of that. So we made that assumption when we started using this data entirely as predictive to the full data set. And as I said, as time got by, we started stratifying that information. But I'm just giving you the course's data. We at the beginning said, you know, this is just a constant fraction. Then we started saying, okay, well, it depends on the age. So we take the age into consideration. We take a pre-existing condition. We started kind of getting more and more detail. We use this to try to do predictions on whether or not we are in regime A or regime B. Are we actually in a stable infection or a growing infection? And we're doing this with the understanding that we are imposing policy. Policy at that time was entirely a lockdown. We closed down schools, we closed down sports and so forth. We allowed supermarkets, but with social distancing. And so there was a policy. And I come back to that point and say, how do we know the causal effect of our policy? Because is this due to the policy or not, or was it because of the virus itself? But right now, embedded in the policy, we're trying to understand, are we effective in making this a stable transmission? Okay, so that was one area. So we were doing this hypothesis test for those of our students who've learned, in our courses. They understand, hypothesis testing is a very important method in assessing, scenarios. So what does that mean? Is our infection, is what we're measuring in a scenario where A minus B is there and B is equal to 0, or B is not equal to 0. If B is equal to 0, we have a growing infection. If B is not equal to 0, then we have a stabilizing infection at some point, okay? So we started collecting the severe data in order to, as I said, kind of assess whether we are in scenario A or scenario B. And we demonstrated that with the existing policy, 35 states out of the full number of states have actually B not equal to 0. This again I'm talking about April and May, so not much known about this. And then we also did this data for the world. I'm not going to bore you with what we discovered at that time because that's history. It wasn't really important. But we could look at Massachusetts at that time, and we were not in that regime. We actually still, had growing number of infections, while, for example, in places in the West Coast, of course, we were doing much better. Oregon was doing much better. Washington State was doing much better, and so forth. So states were different. The contagion was happening differently. So we could actually make conclusion and say, look, Massachusetts is really not doing well. The policy may not be strict enough. Maybe there are denials, too many denials, and so forth. We even were we're trying to do a prediction on what's called the apex. Can we predict when this plateau occurs, right? If we are in the stable regime, can we predict the plateau? And again, we were actually doing fairly well in predicting where the plateau is. I want to highlight the fact that the prediction for California, Los Angeles was right on the money. I mean, literally, we predicted that 14 days before it actually plateaued, and we had that prediction fairly well. We have a harder time in Massachusetts. Look at the error margins over here in terms of our predictions were huge, partially because in California, people were compliant. And in certain suburbs in Massachusetts, people were not compliant, And as a result, we could see that the data that we have that, the apex was not converging. I mean, that we could predict something, but with a huge margin of uncertainty. Now, this picture is really important, not because to say that, oh, we know how to do this, but to say that what we report is not a predicted apex of a certain number of days since the first case. I mean, that's one thing but the level of uncertainty to our prediction. So in California, for example, over here, the level of uncertainty was a few days. In Massachusetts, the level of uncertainty was months, right? What is one lesson about data science is not that you just predict something and you move on. Prediction has to be associated with error margins, with confidence intervals of how confident are you in the results that you get? And it's this confidence that allows us to then design a policy because then we can say, to what extent are we sure about what we talk about? So we don't throw our hands like a typical epidemiologist. I mean, of course, I'm not saying all epidemiologists. We do process the data that we have, but with the caveat of saying, okay, what is this data saying, and how confident are we with the answers? Causal effect was really important. Did the intervention matter? So there's a lot of people that are saying, look, this doesn't make any sense. And I'll come back to that because part of the problem that we had in the lockdown is an economic disaster, an economic disaster across the board, but mostly about the underserved communities, which I will come back to that point. I mean, us as educators and professors, I still was working. I moved from working in person to working on Zoom, but I was working, all my days. I'm giving my lectures and doing my meetings. Everything continued. Of course, was not optimal, but everything continued. But some people could not do their jobs and they were affected. And I want to come back to that point. So a question that came up at that point is, is this intervention what is causing the stabilization? Or is it that the disease on its own stabilizing? Causal effect. So that's another thing we care about. So the first message was error bounds and confidence intervals. Now I want to talk about causal effect. And here we did that with mobility, tried to assess what's the impact of mobility on the growth rate of this particular disease. And I won't bore you with the methodology, but the methodology, again, remember, this is not an experiment that we set up. The pandemic was not a thing that we could try different things, right? We're collecting data from real life. We're collecting data from decisions that are being made. We have a pandemic at hand, right? It's something that is happening. So we can't have a control group like we do in A/B testing and testing different disease and testing different medication. We can't do that. So we define synthetic groups, synthetic control. So there's a methodology by which we can actually statistically define a synthetic control group, and then we can benchmark with respect to the synthetic control group. And we have statistical tests to show whether the synthetic control group is truly a control group. Okay, so that's a methodology that existed that also got reported and used in real time at that time. And we got some fascinating results. So day 0 here indicates the day in which a policy has been implemented. And there are 3 policies that I'm going to focus on, different level of lockdowns. So the dotted blue is less than 10% reduction in mobility, something that the US adopted in the majority of our states. The orange is about 10 to 40% reduction in mobility, and the green is severe reduction, above 40%. We were in the roughly 10%. And based on the synthetic group, we predicted the dotted blue line as the number of, by the way, we took the number of deaths from COVID as our data, because at that time, actually, the number of deaths was the most accurate we can get. Because as I said before, only severe people reported, but not all severe people reported. So even that wasn't clear. But the only thing that was actually reported is death. Now, there was a whole controversy about, how do you define the cause of death? So if I was in the hospital and had a heart attack and I was very ill, and then I got COVID and died, did I die from the heart problem or did I die from COVID? I mean, that continues to be a debate in the medical community. But the doctors have adopted a system. We took that system, we didn't debate it, okay? So the number of deaths was a stable type measurement because every person that died in the US was reported. Every person that was deemed dead because of COVID was reported. So the bottom line is that our prediction was fairly accurate. But here's what would have happened. We are saying that the orange line over here, what would have happened in terms of death rate had we adopted a more severe policy of lockdown. So the claim here is that lockdown had a causal effect. And if, in fact, we pushed harder on lockdown, we would have prevented deaths from COVID. Nothing about economy yet, but just deaths from COVID. United Kingdom, we had similar results for that. For Turkey, it was very interesting. Turkey has actually implemented a more severe reduction, I would say more on the orange line, and we predicted that fairly accurately using our model. And it shows, again, the same trend. Had they relaxed this reduction, it would have gone by the blue line, and if they increased the reduction of mobility, it would have gone by the green line. Sweden, it was also the same, but notice, of course, that even though Sweden reduced mobility, Sweden did not lock down, right? And so the mobility there was actually interesting because they increased the social distancing, but there were no masks, for example. But they did different things. They changed the shifts of schools, but the schools never closed, but they changed the shifts. So that's why the prediction here is not as accurate as we have it, because in some sense, Sweden did everything differently than everyone else. They did that because they wanted to restore their economic situation. That did not materialize in Sweden. The economic benefit that they anticipated did not come to fruition, and we could talk a little bit about that towards the end. Here's what happened in India, and that was very interesting. India had a severe lockdown, and the numbers initially in India were great. Actually, India was showing incredible restraint in terms of the infection, and certainly the number of dead people. Just to kind of get a sense, we would have increased the number of dead people almost by 10 folds had we relaxed the number of the mobility. So now, of course, there's more studies that has been done about that, and you can see that also on our website, where we tracked, for example, India and what happened in India. So we had a time when we thought India had herd immunity because the whole country, it didn't affect Delta. There's a lot of interesting questions. There are some good answers for all of this, which I will not get into, but this doesn't stop, right? The story doesn't stop. But I was trying to put you in the frame of mind of where we were in April and May 2020. This is all analysis that was made in 2020 at the beginning with really limited amount of data. Right now, we have a ton of data to make much better conclusions, but this was a lot of limited data. Very quickly, I want to say about testing, quarantining, and tracing. Okay, so really at the beginning, we had social distancing and masks were the two important components that we could use. And the third one, when testing was possible, is to test and take people, and quarantine when someone is positive. The question that, and we at MIT here, for example, we said, okay, if there is a way for us to limit the number of infection by testing and quarantining, we're going to do that. Okay, we'll accept this as what we call the new normal. It's not normal life, Our classes will be separated, people will be wearing masks, but also we will be testing and quarantining people on a regular basis. So how do we do that? And it was important for us to understand the components of this, and I won't spend too much time on this, but just to let you know that basically, there is this quantity that was very important that everyone talked about, which is the R0 or R0. What is R0? Okay, it's the, what is the number of people, the expected number of people that one person can infect throughout the duration of all their illness. So if you're ill 14 days, or if you're contagious 14 days, what is the expected number of people that you can infect? That's the R0. That's very important because it tells us how this disease amplifies. So you can break it down into, think about how would you come up with this number? There's a certain rate of transmission, right? That depends on the virus and how close I am to you and whether I'm wearing masks or not. That number is really the rate of transmission, right? And we know that for the COVID-19, that was very high. The probability of me infecting you if I come in contact with you was fairly high, okay? With a mask and social distancing, it drops. There is the other number here, C, which is the expected number of people I come across in my day. Now that varies a lot. Some people in a family only meet 2 people a day. Someone who works as a computer hacker, doesn't see that many people, just works on their computer. I teach a class, I meet 50 people in my class. When I go to class, I meet 50 people. So I have a large number of people. But the R0 is just an expected number. But you can, and then TR is the number of days that you think you're contagious, which, we said that, there's 10 to 14 day incubation, but that ultimately we decided it's really concentrated, between the 3rd day and the 7th day. That's the highest infection that we can get. So you can imagine that before social distancing, maybe R0 was about 5 to 6, On campus, it's even worse. It's like 10 and 12 because there's so many more people that come across each other with the parameter C, right? A lot of people come together. So 10 to 12 may be high. And then if you talk about a conference or a meeting, it could be 50, So the number was huge. So you can control this number certainly by social distancing and masks. That's one way to do it. But is there another way to contain that number? And of course, I'll just give you another idea of R0. If R0 was equal to 1, that means that during the whole infection, I can only infect one other person. Then it's a linear growth. It's not a big problem, right? In the sense that I infect one person, that person infects another person, it's contained. But say R naught was equal to 2, then I, during my period, infect 2 people. Now these 2 people each infect 2 people, and that's an exponential growth. So our job is to turn the effective R naught to less than 1. Not the original R naught, but the effective R naught. So how do we do that? By taking ill people or infected people out of the system. So that was the idea that we created, that comes from control theory or decision theory, is to say, look, people get infected at a rate of R naught divided by the duration of their illness. They can go into different directions. People that get infected, either they recover on their own at some rate, they may actually be symptomatic, and then they quarantine themselves because they know they're ill, or they're asymptomatic and we need to figure out how to test them and quarantine them. That's this part over here, TF. So the question that's always everybody was asking is, how do you design TF? What is the rate by which you test people? Okay, so given the social distancing and the masks and so forth, what is the rate that you test people? This was some of the work that we did at MIT to show that basically you have to make R naught smaller than the sum of these components. This one here we could estimate, and then we designed TF to make this inequality possible. This is called a stability inequality. And we did a lot of work to show, that in fact this works. This became the standard for us to apply for how do we test students and faculty and staff on campus to stay stable. And the amazing thing is that we applied all of this from September 2020 on. We're able to bring the students on campus. We controlled the infection. We never had a terrible infection situation. We were paying for this testing. So students were testing twice a week. Faculty and staff were testing once a week. And the system operated in the new normal. Okay. Again, I bring this example because a lot of this was based on a control theory or decision theory aspect, but also about estimating many of these parameters using the partial data that we have. And sometimes we were conservative. Okay. I mean, I would tell you that, sometimes we were testing a little bit more than we needed. We were a little conservative, but it worked. And not only it worked at MIT, it went into a document for the higher education strategy for how higher education should open up. That document dominated many of the universities. That became the guideline for how universities open up. Don't want to spend too much time in all of this. We created simulation models. I don't want to talk about that because I know we're approaching the end of this period. Simulation models were really important. This is what epidemiologists do. But we were guiding these simulation models with simplified data-driven models. And these simplified data-driven models were giving us a sense of what happens, what if scenario, what if we tested here, what if we tested there, and so forth. I'm going to skip this part and just say, and I will say something about the fact that we created one of my colleagues, Peko Hezoi, who's also part of IDSS, created an app called whentotest.org. And that basically became the way, and it was developed simultaneously with NIH. You can Google it, whentotest.org, and it actually allows you a framework to go to basically go into a system, describe the space that you have, describe your policy of masking and social distancing and so forth, put in your budget, and then it tells you how often you can test. Okay, and it allows corporations to say, look, here we apply this app, and here's how quickly we can, how often we should be testing people. But the idea is that you need to be testing people fast enough to remove them before they infect a large number of people, right? So what's that rate that you want to take people out before they infect many other people, given all the parameters that I described from before? Okay, so that's the second thing that I wanted to talk about. So let me transition into talking about something that we're still suffering from. We still are asking questions, and namely, what are the impacts of these interventions on health, on economics, and in particular in inequality? And it's really interesting in healthcare and these pandemics that the first order of business becomes saving people's lives, but then sometimes our method may not be appropriate for saving people's lives from the perspective of economics, because economics for some people is a daily thing. There's quite a few people that didn't have enough money to support themselves, for an extended period of time before without work and so forth. So let me tell you a little bit about that work. This is, by the way, this data that I'm describing here is limited to New York City, and different counties from New York City, although some I will show from United States, but a lot of it is from New York City. So, which features were most relevant for that caused the death behind COVID? It's kind of interesting. Like, what are when you look at the people that died, what are the features that identify the most or most relevant? Income was one of the most relevant ones, before age. Poorer people were dying before richer people. So income was one of the most indicative, kind of informative feature. Above 65, clearly, I mean, these people were, we had huge problems in senior citizen homes, plus people that were ill in hospitals and so forth. So that was the thing. I call it non-whites in the sense that minorities, Hispanics, Black, African Americans, and so forth. Another feature, and I'll show you the decision tree, overcrowding was another big problem. Overcrowding because the transmission was happening at home. Remote work, health insurance, eviction, commuting, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but these are so you can see the distribution of these features and their importance. Here's the first kind of like coarse decision tree that you can build on the COVID-19 deaths. Okay. So we, as I said, we took that from the New York City. The most informative feature that comes out from the decision tree, decision trees optimize over most informative features. The most informative was income. People that were making lower income, the darker colors mean more people were dying than the survivor, right? And the lighter colors had people that died less. So income was actually one of the most informative feature, right away followed by age, okay? And then followed by, followed by age. So income followed by age, and income followed by overcrowding were the most informative features that we had. I can give you the more detailed tree. This is the kind of like a very simple tree that I built, but we built a much more detailed tree to see that income coupled with age over 65, coupled with being non-white, coupled with overcrowding, were producing the largest segment of people that are actually dying. So at the end of the day, in a coarse level, low-income population with older people were dying the most. And these people happen to be in overcrowded communities. And there were some interventions that actually, and I know that this was happening in some part of South America, actually, where they wanted to shuffle people in their homes. Because the way many communities live, they live multiple generations in the same household. And then the younger people will go out to work because they're working their manual work, bring the virus to the home, and then the senior people will die. And, especially the ill ones and so forth. So the low income, which was coupled by overcrowding and coupled by age, sort of ended that. So one strategy that people were trying to implement is to reshuffle the community within the same community, put all the older people together and the younger people together, so that when younger people leave, they bring the virus, but they don't bring it to the older ones. I mean, it had marginal success because you're changing a social structure that is not easy to just kind of shuffle people in their homes, and but definitely there were some attempts to try to kind of change some of that. Here's another aspect that I wanted to also mention here, which is the effect of COVID on unemployment, right? So the real issue is that if you look at the state level, right? I mean, this is kind of the graph is all over the place. I wouldn't say a linear model is an excellent model. But if you look at the unemployment here in 2019, unemployment in 2020. So this is, just kind of trying to see, would have liked to see everything, with respect to a linear curve over here, like X equals Y. You can see that that's not the case, that more unemployment occurred because of COVID. That counties are, by and large, losing employment. You can see that the the fit is less, the fit is not great, you know. At the county level, also you can see this level, which is also interesting. You know, I mean, anyway, this is just data. It's hard to tell because it's very aggregated and you cannot get to the zip code level of all of this. But you can calculate, and I would say that you can calculate the unemployment rate for the worst segment that I created, which is the low income over 65. And we see that the unemployment essentially doubled. You know, while I think the best segment, which actually tend to be younger people and actually rich people, it didn't matter whether you're young or not, there was some unemployment, but by and large, it's a very small fraction that has changed. Also, you can see the eviction rate was really important in all of this. So we try to get a sense here of what is actually happening from the impact of COVID. Is it, and so this is kind of the last part of my talk, is to try to conclude, there is a trade-off, okay? If you send everybody to work, they're gonna contract COVID and potentially die. I mean, we didn't know how deadly this virus is going to be, but we were worried about killing people. So if you send them to work, they either die or they bring the virus to older people to kill them. If you don't send them to work, some people are starving. And it's kind of not an exaggeration to say that literally certain communities did not have enough food to feed themselves and their families, because it was what we refer to as the hand and mouth sort of operation, right? You know, you work that day to bring the money for your people. You know, now this is all before the help came from the state in the United States, where people would start getting checks. You know, before that, so you look at the let me see which one is this. Okay, yeah. So if you look at the trade-off in the rich community, there's no trade-off. In the rich community, there was no trade-off. Actually, you know, if you look at the blue curve and the red curve, the more we lock down, the percentage, this is the percentage of people staying home, the more people stayed home, the less people died. The more people stayed home, not much really happened to the income. It's really almost flat when you think about it. Because, I mean, these people had money, the income would go down maybe a little bit, but they had reserve. So there's no trade-off here. This worked. And potentially, depending on the definition of rich, these people were able to continue their work online because the work is not as manual as the other community. The story is completely different for the poor, where, yes, there's a drop in the death rate because of staying home, but there's an increase. There's an increase in the what we call equivalent death because of income, right? So the income is reducing, and as a result, there's a factor that you can take, which is not large, but still, this is actually an increasing curve. So the picture looks like this. At some level, lockdown was helpful, but then after that, lockdown is not helpful. Lockdown is causing more disparity among the community that is actually underserved. It's this trade-off that we were looking for the whole time the policy was being designed. But we didn't have the data at that time to know what is the right level. How much lockdown, how much separation do we need? A lot of us felt that there's clearly a trade-off, but we couldn't verify that. So it came a little bit late. And then communities actually were just complaining, you know, saying that you know, we're being left alone, you know, either dying from COVID or dying from lack of work and so forth. I mean, luckily then the Congress passed a help sort of, what is it, funding, you know, that came across the board and supported everyone. It is very clear that, for example, surgical funding would have had a lot more effect, that supporting people with certain income right away would have been very helpful in preserving the life of many people, because people were still going to work, irrespective of the regulations or what have you. And again, with that, we created a simulation model to try to do a what if scenario and so forth, which I, you know, because I know I have 5 minutes left, I won't bore you with the simulation model, but we also tested the idea of, you know, among the poor community, if we use the wentotest.org Are we able to save lives? And the answer is yes, testing was helpful. Testing was allowing us to allow people to go back to work, and still be able to preserve their lives and so forth. And that in some ways, that technology was very helpful. And it's entirely based on estimates of the data that we had. So I don't want to, I just want to conclude by saying that intervention is really critical, and intervention is often based on the data. And the parts that we care about is, one, how accurate are we making our predictions? We can make predictions, but how accurate are they is very important. So never just accept a prediction, accept your confidence level in the prediction. That's really critical. Causality matters. Is this the effect of that? Without causality, we cannot really intervene, or we cannot understand the intervention. Or as soon as we create an intervention, we ought to assess whether the intervention is what caused this to happen. Remember, there's a self-regulation feedback. If I see a sick person, I stay away from them. If I read in the newspaper that my region has a spike in the number of COVID-19 infected people, I may wear 2 masks, right? Self-regulate. The self-regulation is embedded in the system, is not an intervention. So you need to understand whether what you're seeing, the phenomenon that you're seeing, is due to the intervention or is due to the self-regulation. And I think that this is all part of the work that went into our group and used a lot of the technology and methodologies that we teach in the MicroMasters and that our students here have been learning. So I come back to the same picture and say that these are all intertwined and interconnected data sets. You make observations, and then as a result, you make decisions. And your decisions change the observations. And then you have to come back and change the decisions. And science is a growing field. Science, data science is like all science. We learn and we adjust, and we learn and we adjust. And as long as we are doing systematically, that's all we can do, right? And so I think it's really critical to recognize that we will never have the answer on anything new right away. But with the ability to think systematically, we can always do something about it to try to alleviate some of the problems that we face and what have you. And so with that, I don't know why it says tomorrow. It's not tomorrow. I would thank everybody for your attention, and I will, I think this is a website where you can find, this is, I don't know why it says tomorrow. I think that was a different talk that I was giving, So I'll end here. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that I portrayed a general picture of what powerful tools that we're learning can do for us in societal problems.
Thank you so much, Mansur, for the talk and the updates. I was thinking that the talk is kind of, there are a lot of applications for the mathematics and statistics that I'm going to be doing during the MicroMasters. So this is kind of inspiration, now that you can use them for something else. And also I have 2 questions I want to ask you, just like a couple of minutes. So are you still, the group is still studying things related with the COVID, or you guys have moved on and are doing other things right now?
We pretty much moved on, right? Because we actually, and I don't remember, Susanna, I think it was in April 2021, we had a workshop that, COVID, and a year later, kind of to conclude our efforts in that. And we brought in a lot of experts from outside, not just from ISODAT, but a lot of collaborators. And I think that will be on our website, I think, with the talks and some of the videos. And we looked at, some of the stuff I was describing to you, actually analysis done later, like the stuff on economic impact. I did that with a couple of my students several years later, because we had to wait for the data, and not several years, several months later, because the data wasn't available at the time when ISODAT was meeting. So I think we're not meeting anymore. I think some of us would like to think that COVID is way behind us and we want to move on with our lives. But once in a while, we still go back to some of these questions. And then also the vaccines came, right? And with vaccines, I think different data science games have been created, and we've done little projects here and there. For example, you know, how powerful are vaccines, and you know, we did some studies, for example, related to the different types of vaccines and effect, but it wasn't done in the context of our group meetings. It was just individual people working on these things.
That's great. I think we all are kind of wanting to leave this behind. And yeah. And another question, because now COVID is not in the news anymore. So when we check the news from the States, it's like all about inflation. So are you doing some studies about that, like inflation and COVID related, or?
So definitely at IDSS, we have a lot of people who are studying. So we actually, you know, so when you just reminded me that one of the areas where some of our students and faculty moved to is supply chain. Because remember, supply chain became a real important and critical consequence of COVID. So in different ways, right? One is the production was reduced because of the reduction of number of people. The other thing is the fragility of systems. So we're seeing this right now, and there are people that are studying. I'm not doing it, but there are people that are studying this work. For example, I don't know if you stay in Italia, if you started traveling. Have you started traveling?
Yeah, regionally, yeah.
Regionally. Well,
Yeah.
wait until you start traveling internationally and see the disasters that are happening. Because what is going on right now, and I've already taken about 5 or 6 trips since I'm able to travel. There's no slack in the system. We lost a lot of workers, a lot of pilots, a lot of people to support it. So what happens is that if you have one person that doesn't show up, there is no alternative. There's no backup. One hostess that doesn't show up, there's no backup, right? And the system holds because this flight doesn't go. That flight has consequences and so forth. So that's one problem. I thought it was a small problem, but it is actually causing, you know, during one of the long weekends, we had Juneteenth, you know, weekend that came up recently. The United States canceled 17,000 flights.
That's a lot. And I'm watching Susanna's face, and I know Susanna is going to be traveling internationally soon. She's kind of worried right now.
Well, I give advice to people and say, if you can take direct flights, take direct flights. Do not take connecting flights right now. I mean, I'm sure you heard about Heathrow, for example, and the shutdowns that they had with American Airlines and British Airways. You know, so there are serious problems. What are they called? They started with COVID. You know, now you're talking about inflation. I mean, we also had a war since then that erupted. You know, it's like a lot of stuff is happening. Is inflation due to inflation was rising, and then we had the Russian-Ukraine war, which impacted not only the oil prices but also wheat, and then of course the fact that there's a war which is draining on economies right and left and so forth. I don't think the Feds have a handle on the interest on the inflation right now, and you know, the U.S. just reacted and added 3/4 of a point on the interest rate, which was not expected, right? And they are saying July they're going to add, you know, increase the interest rate. So I don't have the confidence that the Feds have full control on this process. So people are studying this for sure. Now, you know, a lot of economists are, you know, worried about this, and they're doing a lot of their analysis. And so, yes, I mean, I would say, but we're not doing anything in an organized way. You know, Natalia, something really interesting happened with COVID. That COVID was like a matter of life and death. You know what I mean? Like we were feeling, you know, is this going to wipe us out or something? It's like, it was, you know, we were all stuck in our homes, not knowing what's going on and so forth. I don't think people feel the same way about inflation.
No, obviously not. You're right.
You know, it's like, I mean, we still do our own work. We show up to a cafe. I mean, I paid, you know, just paid $8 for a cup of double espresso somewhere, you know, in Kendall Square. I didn't even notice until I walked out that I paid $8 for a double espresso, you know. I mean, I think if they told me the price ahead of time, I probably wouldn't have paid $8 for a double espresso. I would have gone for a regular coffee. But anyway, so kind of like, right? I mean, it's not the same imminence.
Exactly. Well, Mansur, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, as always, having you here. And I think this is it for today. Then maybe we will see again in the next cohort next year.
Sounds good. Anytime.